The bank door burst open. Two men in black masks appeared on the threshold. One of them immediately shot the security guard. The robbers rushed to the register and forced the teller to put all the money in their bag. As they fled the bank, the police arrived. A shootout ensued. One robber was killed, the second tried to escape, but the cops caught him. When the police tore off his mask, it turned out to be a girl, a local hooligan, 17-year-old Katya Gorохова, nicknamed the Bouncer. An autopsy determined that the guard was killed with her pistol. A trial was held. She received the death penalty for murdering a police officer. The Bouncer was placed in a gas chamber and inhaled with lethal gas. Her childhood flashed before her eyes. She was running through the grass, the sun shining above. The screams of her beloved mother and the chirping of birds. The Bouncer heard a siren wailing. Red lights flashed in her eyes. A loud, metallic voice rang out, a danger warning. She looked around and saw she was in some kind of capsule. Nearby were several more similar capsules, each containing a different girl. Their faces also showed confusion at what was happening and where they were. The capsules opened, and a signpost appeared on the main screen. Instinctively, the girls ran in the indicated direction. They burst into the corridor, ran along it, and at the end, they saw a door. The Bouncer pressed a button near the door, and a terrifying scene appeared before them. A huge hole from a meteorite had been ripped through the ship's windshield. A voice announced that the ship had only 1 hour's oxygen left. The hole needed to be repaired immediately. There was no time to think. The Bouncer suggested patching the hole with the door from a nearby locker. They tried to pry the door off, but it wouldn't budge. Then one of the girls took a blaster from the same locker and shot off the hinges. They finally managed to close the hole. Someone found some duct tape, and they sealed the cracks. The flickering light in the cabin went out completely, apparently due to damage from the meteorite. The Bouncer saw a button on the panel labeled "Emergency Lights" and turned it on. The emergency light came on, illuminating the cabin. The girls cheered, but when they looked at the floor, their joy vanished. One of them was lying on the floor with a head wound. Everyone immediately looked at the girl who had grabbed the blaster and started shouting that she was the killer. She began to frighteningly defend herself, saying that she had thrown the blaster away while looking for duct tape. But no one believed her, and everyone continued shouting that she was the killer. Suddenly, the ship's voice announced that, according to paragraph 3.1 of the rules, in the event of a unanimous conviction, a participant in the Patsonki project in among you is subject to disposal. A robot immediately entered the room. It grabbed the girl and dragged her down the hallway. Everyone ran to see what would happen. The robot threw the accused into the disposal chamber. The girls were confused and bewildered. They began to argue among themselves about who they were. Natasha, nicknamed Freckles, killed her boyfriends because they didn't give her flowers. But when her last boyfriend turned out to be normal and brought her a large bouquet on their first date, she burst into tears and confessed to him all her crimes. The second, Lena, nicknamed Lighter, loved to play with fire and eventually set fire to her hated school right during class. Irina, nicknamed Lefty, declared that she was the most dangerous fighter in the neighborhood. One day, she beat her drinking buddies half to death near a store with her left hand. The victims died in the hospital from their injuries, and she, too, was sentenced to the gas chamber. Olya, a girl nicknamed the Racer, loved to race sports cars at high speeds. One day, she crashed into a bus stop, crushing a bunch of grandmothers. Katya told her story, and the girls realized it was some kind of experiment or simply punishment for being at the death penalty site. Sirens blared, and the familiar voice of the ship announced that the cooling of the ship's nuclear reactor had been compromised, and an explosion would occur in 5 minutes. The girls rushed to the designated location. Finding the engine compartment, they had no idea how to get inside. There was intense radiation. Lefty called to them that she had found a room with protective clothing. The girls donned suits and entered the room. There, they discovered the cause of the accident. One of the reactor's cooling pipes had burst. The nimble Lefty shut off the valve, and the bouncer opened the emergency cooling pipe. The reactor was saved. Suddenly, the racer screamed that she was suffocating and immediately fell to the floor. The boys grabbed her and pulled her out of the radioactive room. They removed her suit, but she was already dead. Radiation must have gotten in through the ruptured hose. They looked at each other suspiciously. Lefty claimed that while they were repairing the reactor, Leiter was standing behind the racer. Perhaps she had torn the hose on her suit. Leiter began to justify herself. Why would she do such a thing? The racer could have damaged the hose herself when she put on her suit. The bouncer and Freckles agreed with Leiter's arguments, and the ship's voice announced that if the majority was against the charges, the suspect would not be disposed of. The siren blared again, and an alarming voice announced that a meteorite hazard had been detected. The automatic meteorite destruction system was not working. Manual control was required. 3 minutes remained until the meteorite impact. The girls raced to the designated location. A giant laser cannon stood in the room, projecting through a viewing window into space. A large monitor showed a huge meteorite hurtling straight toward the ship. The bouncer wanted to sit at the controls, but Leiter pushed her away, trying to show her authority. She sat down in a chair and grabbed the cannon controls. She began aiming the sight at the meteorite, while the other girls watched tensely, their eyes glued to the screen. The impact was only seconds away. Someone nudged Leiter's shoulder, but she ignored it in her anxiety. The sight found its target, and she fired. The meteorite was destroyed, but the girl's joy was short-lived. Freckles' body lay dead next to the chair, and a bloody knife lay at the bouncer's feet. Leiter screamed that the bouncer was the killer. Lefty also took up the accusation. Terrified, they backed away from her and began begging the ship to dispose of her too. Just then, a robot burst into the room and dragged the bouncer into the disposal unit. The doors closed, and Katya found herself in pitch darkness. Suddenly, she heard a rustling sound and turned around. The first accused was hiding in the corner behind the trash cans. The monitor screen lit up, and the kids saw Lefty and Leiter. They were chatting pleasantly, but suddenly Lefty pressed the button to close the doors, crushing the Leiter into a pancake. Lefty started laughing into the monitor camera, telling them they were all idiots and hadn't realized she was the designated murderer on this show, which was now watched by millions of Robloxers. She explained how she picked up a blaster and, in complete darkness, using her night vision goggles, killed her first victim with her left hand, hitting him in the right eye. And how could they not have guessed she was the one who ruined the racer's suit, since she was the only one in the compartment where the spacesuits were kept? And how could they not have guessed that she had also killed the imp? After all, the fatal blow had also come from Lefty. Pleased with her victory on the tomboy show in Among Us, Lefty pressed the disposal button. The floor in the room opened up, and the girls fell below. A satisfied Lefty sat down in the ship's pilot's seat, and a voice congratulated her on her victory. But she didn't yet know that the bouncer had managed to grab a bracket on the ship's hull at the last moment, closed her suit, and made her way to the hole in the windshield. With all her might, the bouncer leapt onto the patch and fell into the ship's cabin. The iron door fell conveniently on the left-hander. The bouncer didn't even have to fight it. The alarm sounded again, and a voice announced that the rules of the game had been violated. The ship was returning to the planet, but, unfortunately, the oxygen had already run out. Katya realized there was no way to escape and calmly wandered down the corridor, humming a song. Sweet, but there's more to life. A powerful jolt knocked the bouncer to the floor. The system announced a ship collision. A fire had broken out on board. The bouncer darted away from the smoke and saw the surface of another ship through the emergency exit porthole. It turned out that her ship had collided with another, and now they were flying together like a sandwich. She jumped onto the surface of the other ship and started running around it, screaming to be let in. Finding a hatch, the bouncer tried to open it, but it was no use. The oxygen in her spacesuit had run out. Her vision began to darken. She pounded on the hatch with all her might, but no one opened it, and the light in her eyes went out. In the darkness, the bouncer noticed a beam of light. It was some kind of door. Her mother stood next to it, crying bitterly. The bouncer came up and asked why she was crying. Her mother told her that the young racer would not be allowed into heaven for her sins. And then a door nearby opened. A racer peered out and invited her in. But the bouncer didn't want to go to hell. She clung to her mother and began to cry too. The disgruntled racer tugged at her arm, declaring that the bouncer should be punished for her sins. The bouncer came to and screamed. Someone covered her mouth and whispered that the alien could hear them. The bouncer looked around and realized she was safe. A stranger nicknamed the Pacifier reported hearing the bouncer banging on the hatch and decided to save her. But when she climbed out, the bouncer was already unconscious, and the Pacifier dragged her into the ship. The bouncer became curious about where she was now, what was happening on this ship, and why the Pacifier was wearing prison clothes. The Pacifier began her terrifying tale. It turned out that this was a women's space prison for especially dangerous criminals, and that the Pacifier was serving a life sentence there for serious crimes. In the evenings, she met rich guys and invited them to hang out at a cafe. She spiked the victim's drink with clonidine. And when the rich man fell asleep right at the table, she stole from him. But one day, the Pacifier overdosed on the clonidine, and the victim fell asleep forever. That's how she ended up here. The Pacifier has been flying in space on this ship for 5 years. And everything was calm until one moment. One day, the prison guards received a distress signal from a passing ship. A rescue team was sent to the stranded ship to save the crew, but it turned out that everyone on board had been brutally murdered except for one girl. Apparently, she hid well from the killer, and she was lucky. They were unable to find the killer himself. The girl was taken to the prison hospital. She was very frightened and did not answer the warden's questions. They injected her with a sedative and decided to leave her alone until she recovered. A noise was heard somewhere on the ship, and the pacifier briefly stopped her story, afraid of being overheard. The next morning, the girl was found dead with an abdominal injury. The chief inspector suspected the nurse who was on duty at the hospital that night. He summoned her for questioning and spoke with her at length. Evening fell, and they still hadn't left the inspector's office. All the staff had gone to their cabins, and the cleaning lady began disinfecting the premises. When she entered the inspector's office, her terrified cry could be heard throughout the ship. The nurse lay dead on the floor, and the inspector had disappeared. The prison director concluded that the inspector had killed the nurse during interrogation and then hidden on the ship. It was decided to find him and arrest him. A search began, and half an hour later, one of the guards reported finding the suspect in the ship's utility room. At that moment, the inspector tripped the fire alarm, and the fire suppression system in the prisoners' cells was activated. At first, the prisoners were having fun, splashing around in the water and enjoying an unscheduled shower. But soon everyone realized the water wasn't stopping and their cells would soon be flooded to the ceiling. They began screaming and begging the guards to let them out of their cells, but the guards were afraid to open the flooded compartment without permission from their superiors. The water quickly filled the cells, and all the prisoners drowned. By this time, the prison warden reached the maintenance bay. The inspector was already dead. Guard James, who discovered him, reported that the prisoner had detonated a grenade in his own hands during the arrest. Apparently, he didn't want to surrender. The warden could no longer assess the situation clearly. The radio reported the cells were flooded, and he completely panicked. He was forced to return to his office to contact ground control and report an emergency on the ship. During the call, the connection was lost. Someone had damaged the antenna located on the surface of the ship. It turned out that the same guard, James, had climbed outside and destroyed the antenna. No one understood why he did it. He was caught and placed in solitary confinement until the circumstances were clarified. The bouncer stopped the pacifier's story. She wondered how the pacifier herself had survived if all the prisoners had drowned. The pacifier explained that she worked in the kitchen as an assistant cook. They were just washing dishes after dinner. First, the water in the faucet disappeared, and then the eerie cries of drowning prisoners began. Archie, the duty officer, came to them and informed them that there was an emergency on the ship and they needed to go to the solitary confinement until the problem was resolved. Then the bouncer asked her how the pacifier had ended up there if she had been placed in solitary confinement. The pacifier continued. They sat in solitary confinement for about a week. One night, they heard pitiful cries and smoke. After some time, the ship's pilot opened their solitary confinement and reported that a fire had started in the personnel sleeping quarters. The central exit from the quarters was also on fire, and the personnel were unable to escape. The pilot gave the prisoners fire-resistant suits and fire extinguishers and asked them to help him put out the fire. They managed to put out the flames and rescue the warden and a couple of other guards. The rest of the ship's personnel perished. All the survivors gathered in the cockpit and began to figure out what had happened. The pilot reported that when the fire started, he went to the source of the fire and along the way saw the duty officer, Archie, who was guarding the isolation cell. Archie looked strange and didn't respond to the pilot's questions. And in the isolation cell, someone brutally murdered the guard. James, who had broken the antenna, noticed the nipple. This Archie is most likely a saboteur too, and he needs to be found and neutralized, the warden suggested. They split into groups. Soska's group headed toward the cafeteria, and the second group headed toward the armory. The pilot went to fix the antenna to contact the ground. As they passed the cafeteria, Poverica offered to take a box of stewed meat with them. You never know, this situation could drag on for a long time. And I don't want to die of hunger at all. The guard sent us to get some canned food, and he himself went to inspect the showers. As they were getting the box, shots were heard coming from the showers. Coming closer, Soska and Poverica peeked through the keyhole. A guard stood in the middle of the showers, pistol in hand, and Archie lay shot on the floor. His stomach was moving very strangely. The guard watched in surprise, when suddenly Archie's stomach burst open, and some kind of monster crawled out. The girls were frightened and ran toward the armory. The bouncer was shocked by Soska's story, but she was curious and demanded to know more. Soska continued. She and Poveric found the warden and crawled out. His stomach crawled out. The girls were frightened and ran toward the armory. The bouncer was shocked by Soska's story, but she was curious and demanded to know more. Soska continued. She and Poveric found the warden and reported the incident in the showers. The warden ordered them to arm themselves and go rescue Jacob. When they approached the showers, the door was open. Archie was also lying on the floor with a hole in his stomach. But Jacob himself was missing. Everyone was worried that the monster had killed him and possibly eaten him. The pilot reported over the radio that he had managed to fix the antenna, and the whole crowd went to the director's office to quickly contact ground. The special communication worked, and the director managed to reach General Tomos. Upon learning of what had happened, the general ordered the director to destroy the ship along with the survivors, to prevent this alien from reaching Earth. The warden could not disobey the general's orders. After finishing the conversation, he sat down at his computer, entered the security password, and activated the ship's self-destruct. All the survivors simply stood there, looking at each other, unsure what to do. The office was deathly silent. When Jacob suddenly entered, everyone started asking him how he managed to survive and where the alien was. Jacob explained that at first he was scared and ran from the monster, but, finding himself at a dead end, he had no choice, so Jacob started shooting at it. He managed to kill the creature. The guys were delighted and asked to see his body. But Jacob surprised everyone by revealing that he had flushed the alien's remains down the toilet. You never know, it's contagious. The cook noticed the blood on Jacob's face. He explained that it was most likely Archie's blood and that he hadn't even noticed it. Soska remembered that moment in the shower and realized Jacob was lying, but decided not to panic and remain silent. The timer ticked down inexorably, and the tension in the air grew. The director suggested diffusing the situation and invited everyone into the service room for a relaxing drink. The guards had found plenty of bottles of Bloxicol in their closet. They set the table and began celebrating their inevitable demise. Soska noticed that Jacob wasn't touching the harmful drinks and began insisting that the bearded man join them in drinking. But he complained of a severe headache and flatly refused. The guys thoroughly relaxed. Someone turned on the music and the dancing began. By the end of the party, everyone was quite tired, took off their gear, and went to bed. Right there, the bouncer interrupted Soska's story again. She grabbed her with shaking hands to find out if the director had disabled the ship's self-destruct. Soska sadly announced that they only had an hour left before the explosion, and continued. Jacob thoughtfully turned off the lights till the boys felt more comfortable, and he waited until everyone was asleep, pulled out a knife, and approached the director. But the cunning Soska wasn't asleep. She grabbed a chair and hit Jacob on the head with all her might. Everyone woke up from the noise. Soska explained what he had wanted to do and recalled the deception with the blood on his face. They handcuffed the traitor and began interrogating him about why he wanted to kill the director, but Jacob remained silent. It became clear to everyone that he wouldn't confess. Then the prison director ordered guard Matthew to throw the criminal into outer space. But Matthew couldn't drag the heavy Jacob away, and Cook had to go with him. On the way to the disposal bay, Jacob became talkative. He began explaining to the boys that he simply wanted to take the key from the director and disable the ship's self-destruct. Matthew stopped. Apparently, he had been thinking about this too, pulled out a gun, and asked Cook what she thought about it. The bouncer became worried. Where are all those traitors now? Soska, she continued. All three entered the room and demanded that the director cancel the ship's self-destruct, but the director refused. For disobeying an order, he would face a tribunal on Earth, so he had nothing to lose. Then they attacked the director, trying to take the key from him. In the confusion, a shot rang out. The fight stopped. A stray bullet hit the poor director directly. All this time, the pacifier stood to the side with her hands raised, trying not to attract attention. The traitors began to search the director and rummage around the room looking for the key. Meanwhile, the pacifier quietly approached the exit and took off running. That's how she ended up here. The bouncer didn't understand why the pacifier didn't try to find the key with everyone else. The pacifier explained that when Matthew and the cook were dragged off to throw out the traitor, she suggested the warden carefully review all the surveillance footage. They began reviewing it. One of the cameras showed the isolation cell where the suspect James, who had broken the antenna, was being held. They came to him for an inspection. Archie, the security guard, walked in. Suddenly, James fell to the floor. The alien burst out of his stomach. Archie didn't have time to react before the creature darted at his face and climbed into his mouth. At first, Archie fell and twitched, but then he got up and ran somewhere. Everything was clear. This thing enters the body through the mouth and begins to control the victim. But when the host is in danger, it bursts out through the stomach and takes over the next body. Realizing this, the director sensed trouble, took out the key and swallowed it. It turns out that this thing is now in Jacob, and it controls him. The bouncer concluded. Pacifier nodded affirmatively in response. The bouncer suggested getting to the director, getting the key from him, disabling the explosives and then dealing with this monster in the body of the guard. But Pacifier didn't know how to get to the director. Moreover, the enemies could notice them on the cameras. The bouncer remembered her childhood, how she and the boys broke into the grocery store through ventilation. It was her first robbery. Back then, they were caught by the guard, and she was registered with the police. But now she hoped that everything would work out. The boys found a suitable place and climbed into the ventilation. They crawled there for about half an hour and finally found the very room. The cook was sitting behind the monitors. The director was lying on the floor, shot at, and that same Jacob was sitting on a chair. The boys suddenly pounced on the cook and easily dealt with her between the two of them. Soska assumed that the alien had gotten out of Jacob and was now sitting in the cook. Without consulting the bouncer, grabbed a knife and dealt with the suspect. And then, in cold blood, she took the treasured key from the director. There was little time left before the ship's self-destruction, and the boys ran to turn off the timer. But Matthew was waiting for them there. He was bleeding and holding on to the rifle with the last of his strength. As soon as the boys entered the office, Matthew unloaded all his. The bouncer pointed her gun at the dying guard and was about to finish him off. Matthew was barely breathing, but he had enough strength to tell the bouncer that the alien was in the nipple. It turned out that almost all of her story was true until one moment, when they were interrogating Jacob. This creature crawled out of him and entered the pacifier. She twitched a little, and then grabbed the gun and demanded the key to the director's computer. The director swallowed the key, and the pacifier shot him. Then she wanted to kill the others, but she ran out of bullets. Matthew and the cook tried to neutralize her, but the pacifier managed to escape. Apparently, she then saved the bouncer and tricked him into helping her get the key. Matthew asked the bouncer not to stop the timer. This alien had to be destroyed. Less than a minute remained until self-destruction. The bouncer heard eerie sounds behind her and turned around. This little monster crawled out of her stomach. It was wounded, and apparently very angry. The ship exploded, but not before an escape pod was released. Only the most observant among you will guess who was inside. Yeah,